The moment I stepped through that mahogany door, I knew I had either made the best decision of my life or the worst mistake I could imagine. Patricia Whitmore's face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace, like she had just bitten into a lemon while trying to pose for a photo. Her eyes slowly traveled over my simple navy dress, my modest flats, my drugstore earrings, and I could practically see her calculating my worth in her head and deciding I had none. She leaned toward her son, my fiancé Marcus, and whispered something she clearly believed I wouldn't hear, but I heard every word. She said I looked like the help who had wandered in through the wrong entrance. And in that exact moment, I knew this dinner was going to be very, very interesting. My name is Ella Graham. I'm 32 years old, and I have a confession to make. For the past 14 months, I've been keeping a secret from the man I was supposed to marry. Not a small secret, like eating the last slice of pizza and blaming it on the dog. Not even a medium secret, like the fact that I still sleep with a stuffed animal from childhood. No, my secret was that I make $37,000 a month. Before taxes, the number is almost obscene. After taxes, it's still the kind of figure that makes accountants pause, squint at the screen, and ask if there's been some kind of mistake. I'm a senior software architect at one of the largest tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. I've been writing code since I was 15, sold my first app at 22, and I've been climbing the corporate ladder ever since. I hold 3 patents. I've spoken at international conferences. I have stock options that would make most people's eyes water. And Marcus thought I was an administrative assistant who could barely afford her rent. I never actually lied to him. When we met at a coffee shop 14 months ago, he asked what I did, and I told him I worked in tech. He nodded like he understood, then asked if I handled scheduling for the executives. I smiled and gave a vague answer about supporting the team. He filled in the blanks on his own, and I never corrected him. So why would I do that? Why would I let the man I was dating, the man I was falling in love with, believe I was struggling financially when I could have bought his car 10 times over? The answer goes back to the most important person in my life. My grandmother raised me after my parents passed away when I was 7. She lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, drove an older car, shopped at regular grocery stores, and never wore anything flashy. She taught me to cook simple meals, to enjoy small pleasures, and to never measure my worth by the number in my bank account. What I didn't know until she passed away, when I was 24, was that my grandmother was worth several $1,000,000. She had built a small business empire when she was young, invested wisely, and chose to live simply because she believed character mattered more than appearance. She left everything to me, along with a letter I still keep in my nightstand. In that letter, she wrote something I've never forgotten. She said a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. When they believe you have nothing to offer them, when they think you're beneath their notice, that's when you see who they really are. So when Marcus invited me to dinner at his parents' estate, when he hinted that this might be the night things got serious, when he mentioned that his mother was very particular about first impressions, I made a choice. I decided to give the Whitmore family the same test my grandmother had taught me. I would show up as the simple, unassuming woman they expected. I would wear modest clothes, drive my old car, and speak humbly about my circumstances. And I would watch how they treated someone they believed couldn't help them, someone they thought was beneath them, someone they assumed had nothing to offer. And before you judge me, before you think I was being manipulative or dishonest, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what your partner's family really thinks of you? Have you ever felt that the smiles were forced and the compliments were hollow? Have you ever wanted to know the truth, even if it might hurt? I wanted to know. I needed to know, because I wasn't just considering marrying Marcus. I was considering marrying into his family. And families, as my grandmother always said, are forever. Now, before I continue, let me take a quick moment. If you're enjoying this so far, please hit the like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love reading those comments and seeing people from all over the world tuning in at every hour. It means more to me than you probably realize. Okay, back to the story. The Whitmore estate was exactly what I expected and somehow still managed to shock me with its excess. The driveway alone was longer than some of the streets I've lived on. The gates were raw iron with gold accents, because apparently regular iron wasn't pretentious enough. The lawn was trimmed with the kind of precision that made it feel like someone measured each blade of grass with a ruler. As I drove my 12-year-old Subaru Outback up that flawless driveway, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Simple makeup, my hair pulled back into a low ponytail, my grandmother's small gold studs in my ears, the only jewelry I wore. I looked exactly like someone who didn't belong there. Perfect. Marcus met me at the door and kissed me, but it felt slightly performative. Like he was doing it for an audience. His eyes flicked over my dress, my shoes, my lack of accessories, and I saw something in his expression that I had never noticed before. Embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked. I quietly noted that for later. Inside, the house was a monument to new money desperately trying to pass itself off as old money. Crystal chandeliers hung from every ceiling. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, though it was obvious they were prints, not originals. The furniture was expensive but clearly uncomfortable, chosen for how it looked rather than how it felt. And there, standing in the foyer like a queen surveying her kingdom, was Patricia Whitmore. She was in her early 60s, with a face that clearly showed the careful work of several very skilled surgeons. Her blonde hair was styled into a perfect helmet that probably required industrial-strength hairspray to maintain. Her dress was designer, her jewelry was real, and her smile was completely and utterly fake. She extended her hand toward me as if granting an audience. I shook it and immediately felt the limpness, the dismissal, the total lack of warmth. Then she made that comment to Marcus, the one about me looking like the help, and I smiled politely and pretended I hadn't heard a thing. The night was just beginning, and it was already clear it was going to be interesting. If I had known what I was truly walking into that evening, I might have chosen to wear armor instead of a navy dress. But then again, I've always believed that the best kind of armor is information, and I had done my homework. The Whitmore family owned a chain of car dealerships spread across 3 states. Not flashy luxury brands you see in movies, but solid, respectable mid-range vehicles aimed at regular families. Marcus's father, Harold, had inherited the business from his own father and spent the last 30 years expanding it. Patricia married into the family at 23 and immediately began climbing the social ladder with the focus of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. They had 2 children. Marcus, my fiancé, was 34 and worked as a marketing manager at a company completely unrelated to the family business, which I had learned was a sore subject for Harold, who had expected his son to take over the dealerships. Then there was Vivian, the older sister, 38 years old, who treated the family fortune like her personal piggy bank. I found all of this through public records, social media, and a few carefully placed Google searches. I had seen the photos of lavish parties, society events, and charity galas. I had read articles praising Patricia's philanthropy, though a closer look showed that most of her donations came with generous tax benefits and plenty of publicity. None of that prepared me for meeting Vivian in person. She arrived 20 minutes late, which I would later learn was her signature move. Making an entrance mattered more to her than respecting anyone else's time. She swept into the living room wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, diamonds dripping from her ears and neck as if she had fallen into a jewelry store and walked out covered in merchandise. Her greeting to me was a single word delivered with the warmth of a frozen fish. Hello. Not hello, nice to meet you. Not hello, Marcus has told us so much about you. Just hello, paired with a slight curl of her lip, like she'd smelled something unpleasant. I smiled and said hello back. She immediately turned to her mother and started a conversation that deliberately excluded me, discussing some charity event and whether the florist had been fired yet for last month's disaster. I stood there holding the glass of water I'd been given, feeling about as welcome as a vegetarian at a steakhouse. Marcus hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't say a word. That was the second observation I quietly filed away. Harold Whitmore was different. He was a large man, the the kind who had probably been athletic once but had since given in to the comforts of wealth. He shook my hand with a grip meant to impress, though it just felt tired. His eyes were sharp, though, and I noticed him watching me with something close to curiosity. There was another guest at the dinner, someone I hadn't expected. An older man named Richard Hartley, introduced as a longtime family friend and business associate. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair and keen eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When he shook my hand, his gaze lingered on my face with a flicker of recognition that confused me. I wondered if we had met before, but I couldn't place him. He didn't say anything, yet throughout the evening I kept catching him looking at me with that same puzzled expression. Patricia led us into the dining room, which looked like someone had been given an unlimited budget and absolutely no taste. The table was long enough for a royal banquet. The chairs were upholstered in what I assumed was real silk, and the place settings included more forks than I had ever seen outside a restaurant supply store. I counted them. 6 forks for one meal. I've seen surgeries done with fewer tools. Patricia noticed me looking at the silverware and smiled that frozen smile of hers. She said she supposed I wasn't used to formal dining, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I replied that my grandmother had always taught me it wasn't the forks that mattered, but the company you shared the meal with. Patricia's smile tightened just slightly. Vivian snorted into her wine glass, and dinner began. The first course was some kind of soup I couldn't identify, but it probably cost more per bowl than my weekly grocery bill. Patricia used this moment to start what I later thought of as the interrogation. She asked where I grew up. I said a small town in Oregon, which was true. She asked about my family. I said my grandmother had raised me, also true. She asked what my parents did. I told her they had passed away when I was young. Patricia made a sound meant to be sympathetic, but it came out more like a clogged drain clearing. She commented on how difficult it must have been to grow up without proper guidance. I replied that my grandmother gave me all the guidance I ever needed. Vivian leaned forward, her diamonds catching the chandelier light, and asked what my grandmother had done for a living. I said she was a businesswoman. Vivian's eyebrows lifted slightly as she asked what kind of business. I answered that they were small ventures, nothing very exciting. The truth was my grandmother had built a company she eventually sold for several $1,000,000, but that truth wouldn't serve me tonight. Patricia moved on and asked about my current job. I said I worked in tech. She asked if I was a secretary. I said I was more of a support role. Patricia nodded with satisfaction, as if this confirmed every assumption she'd already made about me. She commented that every team needed support staff. Marcus shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, but still stayed silent. That was when Vivian decided to bring up Alexandra. The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples across the table. Vivian said it casually, as if she were talking about the weather. She mentioned she'd run into Alexandra the week before, that she was doing wonderfully, that her family's business was thriving. I watched Marcus closely and saw something flicker across his face, guilt or nervousness maybe, gone before I could pin it down. Patricia seized the moment eagerly. She said Alexandra had always been such a lovely girl, so accomplished, so perfectly suited to their lifestyle. She mentioned that Alexandra had been Marcus's girlfriend for 3 years. Did I know that? I said I didn't. Patricia smiled and said it was such a shame when they broke up, that everyone had expected them to end up together. Alexandra's family owned an import company dealing in luxury vehicles, which would have been a perfect match for the Whitmore dealerships. The message was unmistakable. Alexandra had been the right choice. I was not. I glanced around the dining room and noticed the photographs on the wall behind me for the first time. I turned slightly and saw a gallery of family moments, holidays, birthdays, graduations, and in at least 4 of those pictures, a beautiful dark-haired woman stood beside Marcus, her arm linked through his, her smile glowing. Alexandra. Patricia followed my gaze and said nothing, but her satisfaction was almost tangible. Vivian pushed a little further, remarking that Alexandra was still single, surprising really, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. I turned back to the table and smiled, saying she sounded like a remarkable woman. That wasn't the reaction Vivian expected. She blinked, momentarily thrown off. Patricia recovered quickly and agreed that Alexandra was remarkable, then added, with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, that she hoped I didn't feel too out of place in their world given my modest background. I asked her what she meant by modest. Patricia's smile sharpened. She said she understood that not everyone was born with certain advantages, that some people had to work ordinary jobs and live ordinary lives, and that there was no shame in being common. Common. The word landed hard. I felt something shift inside me, but I kept my face calm. I had come to learn the truth about these people, and the truth was revealing itself clearly. Marcus finally spoke, saying his mother didn't mean anything by it, that she was just being protective. Patricia patted his hand and said of course she was, a mother always wants the best for her son. The rest went unsaid, hanging in the air like smoke. And you are not the best. Harold cleared his throat and tried to change the subject, asking about my hobbies and whether I had interests outside work. I said I liked reading, hiking, and cooking simple meals, nothing fancy. Vivian laughed and said that was adorable, like a child listing favorite pastimes. Richard spoke up then, for the first time since we sat down. He said there was something to be said for simple pleasures, that his own grandmother had lived modestly and had been the happiest person he ever knew. Patricia shot him a look sharp enough to curdle milk. Richard ignored it and continued watching me with that thoughtful expression. He asked what my grandmother's name had been. I answered, Margaret Graham. Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. He just nodded once, thoughtfully, and returned his attention to his soup. The rest of the dinner unfolded much the same way. Patricia and Vivian took turns asking questions carefully designed to remind me of my place, which in their minds was far below theirs. Marcus made the occasional weak attempt to defend me, but there was no real conviction behind it. Harold remained mostly quiet, observing everything with the weary resignation of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with his wife was pointless. And through it all, Richard kept watching me. By the time dessert was served, I had learned everything I needed to know about the Whitmore family. They were snobs of the highest order, people who measured human worth in money and social connections. To them, I wasn't a person, I was an obstacle, a problem to be solved, a mistake Marcus had made that needed correcting. But I had also learned something else, something I hadn't expected. Marcus was not the man I thought he was. The Marcus I had fallen in love with was kind, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in me as a person. This Marcus, the one sitting at his mother's table while she tore me apart without offering any real defense, was someone else entirely. Someone weaker. Someone who cared more about his family's approval than protecting the woman he claimed to love. I wondered which version of Marcus was real. I was about to find out. After dessert, Patricia announced that we would have coffee in the sitting room. The men drifted toward the windows to talk business. Vivian excused herself to take a phone call. Patricia said she needed to speak with the housekeeper and would join us shortly. That left me alone with my thoughts and, more importantly, with an opportunity. I excused myself to use the bathroom. Marcus pointed me toward the back of the house, down a long hallway lined with even more pretentious artwork. I walked slowly, taking it all in. The house was impressive in terms of money, but it felt cold and hollow, like a museum no one actually lived in. I found the bathroom easily enough, but I wasn't really looking for it. I was looking for clarity, for information, for something that would help me understand what this evening truly was. What I found was far better. As I passed a partially open door, I heard voices. Patricia's voice and Vivian's. I stopped. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to respect their privacy, to not turn into someone who eavesdropped like a character in a soap opera. But there was something sharp and urgent in Patricia's tone that made me pause. I stepped closer, staying in the shadows. Patricia was saying they needed to deal with this situation quickly, that Marcus couldn't be allowed to make this mistake. Vivian agreed. She said she couldn't believe he had actually brought me there, that she'd assumed this was just a phase, like his vegetarian period in college. Patricia replied that this was far more serious than a diet. This woman could ruin everything. My heart started to pound. They were talking about me. Of course they were. But what came next made my blood run cold. Vivian said the timing couldn't be worse. They needed the merger with the Castellano family to go through, and Marcus needed to be with Alexandra for that to happen. Castellano. Alexandra's family. The luxury car importers. Patricia agreed, saying the dealerships were in trouble and they needed the Castellano partnership to survive the next fiscal year. The floor seemed to shift beneath me. I had suspected something from my research, but this confirmed it. Vivian went on, saying Marcus was supposed to keep Alexandra interested while they worked out the details. That had always been the plan. Alexandra's family would invest in the dealerships, and in return they would gain access to the Whitmore distribution network. Patricia said Marcus had assured her he was keeping his options open with Alexandra. Options open. While he was proposing to me. I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. This wasn't just snobbery. This wasn't a family who disliked their son's girlfriend. This was calculated. Strategic. Marcus wasn't just weak. Marcus was using me. But why? Why keep me around if Alexandra was always the endgame? Vivian answered that question. She said Marcus was an idiot. He actually seemed to like this little secretary, this nobody. He was supposed to use her as a placeholder until the deal with Alexandra was finalized, but he was getting attached. A placeholder. That's what I was. A distraction. Someone to keep Marcus occupied while the family handled their business arrangements. Patricia said they would take care of it. They would announce the engagement that night, get Marcus publicly committed to me. Then find a way to end it before the wedding. Once Alexandra was secured, they would suddenly discover some terrible secret about me that justified breaking things off. Vivian asked what kind of secret. Patricia said they would invent one if they had to. I stood there in that hallway, frozen, listening to two women plan the destruction of my relationship as casually as if they were planning a dinner party. Then Vivian said something that made it even worse. She said at least I was too stupid to suspect anything, that Marcus had picked well in that regard. I was naive, trusting, probably just grateful that someone like Marcus had noticed me at all. Patricia laughed and agreed. I stepped back from the door and moved silently down the hall. My hands were shaking, not from hurt, but from anger. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was naive. They thought I was so desperate for love that I'd accept whatever scraps they threw my way. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I found the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't broken. She wasn't devastated. She was thinking. I had come here to test Marcus's family, and they had failed spectacularly. But the test had revealed something far worse. Marcus himself was part of the problem. He wasn't trapped between me and his family. He was actively deceiving me. Now the question was what to do. I could confront him. I could walk back out there, expose everything I had heard, create a scene, and leave this house forever. But that would be too easy. They would dismiss me as emotional, dramatic, bitter. They would tell themselves I was proving their point. If I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it my way, on my terms, with a plan they would never see coming. My grandmother had taught me many lessons, but one stood above all others. When someone underestimates you, they give you a gift. The gift of surprise. Patricia and Vivian had just given me the greatest gift of all. They had no idea what I was capable of. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and walked back to the sitting room with a smile on my face. The game was just beginning. When I returned, something had changed. The furniture had been subtly rearranged, the lighting adjusted. Patricia stood by the fireplace with barely concealed anticipation. Harold positioned himself near the doorway, looking uneasy. Vivian pretended to study a painting, though I caught her smirking at Marcus. Marcus stood in the center of the room, looking nervous. Too nervous. He turned when he saw me, his face breaking into what was meant to be a loving smile. He walked over, took my hands, and said he wanted to ask me something. I felt the trap closing. Marcus said he knew we hadn't been together long and that his family could be overwhelming, but he said he knew what he wanted. He said he wanted me, then dropped to one knee. The ring was large and flashy, exactly the kind Patricia would approve of. Up close, I could see its flaws. The diamond was cloudy. The setting uneven. It was the kind of ring that looked impressive in dim light but revealed its imperfections in daylight, much like the man holding it. Marcus asked me to marry him. Behind him, Patricia beamed. This was the plan. Get him publicly committed to me, then discard me later. In the meantime, keep Alexandra waiting while they finalized their business deal. I understood all of this in a heartbeat. I also knew I had a choice. I could say no. I could walk away with my dignity intact and never see any of them again. But that would end the story too soon. I thought about the hallway conversation. About their plan to invent lies about me. About how disposable they thought I was. And I thought about how satisfying it would be to show them exactly how wrong they were. So I said yes. Patricia clapped like she was watching a stage performance. Vivian congratulated us with all the warmth of an Alaskan winter. Harold shook Marcus's hand and said he'd done well. Across the room, Richard caught my eye. There was something knowing in his expression, like he sensed this story wasn't over. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and fake congratulations. Patricia talked about engagement parties. Vivian discussed venues. Harold mentioned potential business opportunities from the union of our families, though he stumbled over that part, clearly unsure what my family could possibly contribute. Marcus stayed close, playing the devoted fiancé convincingly. If I hadn't heard his mother and sister, I might have believed him. But I had heard, and I wouldn't forget. When the night ended, Marcus walked me to my car. The air was cold and clear. He asked if I was okay, said his family could be a lot, but promised they'd warm up to me eventually. I said I understood. I said I was tired. He kissed me goodnight, and I drove away with his ring on my finger and a plan forming in my mind. The next morning, I began my research. My job had taught me the power of information, data, and documentation. I spent my days analyzing systems, finding weaknesses, optimizing solutions. I was about to apply those same skills to the Whitmore family. What I discovered over the next few days confirmed everything I'd heard and more. The Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble. Not a temporary slump, but deep structural issues. They had expanded too fast, taken on too much debt, and now the consequences were catching up. Their main franchise agreement was up for renewal, and the manufacturer was considering other options. The partnership with Alexandra's family wasn't just strategic. It was desperate. But that wasn't the end of it. As I kept digging, I uncovered something else, something the Whitmores probably believed was buried forever. Vivian had been stealing from the family business. At first, the amounts were small, quietly hidden in expense reports and petty cash records, but over the years they had piled up. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off to support her lifestyle while the company itself struggled. I printed everything I found, legal papers, financial statements, records of suspicious transactions, and then I started making calls. My grandmother's name still carried influence in certain circles. The business contacts she had built relationships with over decades still respected the Graham family, and when I reached out, they were more than willing to talk. One of those contacts knew Richard Hartley. And as it turned out, Richard had his own history with the Whitmore family. Years earlier, they had cheated him in a business deal. It hadn't been illegal, just unethical enough to leave a lasting bitterness. He had been waiting for a chance to settle the score, and I was about to hand him that chance. Before I go on, I just want to say something honestly. This channel means a lot to me, and every like, every comment, every subscription helps more than you can imagine. If you're enjoying this story, please take just 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button. It really does make a difference. Thank you. Now back to what happened next. The following weeks became a test of patience and performance. I played the role of the happy fiancé like an award-winning actress. I attended family dinners at the Whitmore estate, smiled through Patricia's passive-aggressive remarks, and watched Vivian parade around in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, knowing exactly where that money had come from. And I watched Marcus. He seemed different, or maybe I was finally seeing him clearly for the first time. The attentiveness I once found charming now felt calculated. His compliments sounded rehearsed, and his phone, which he guarded more carefully every day, kept buzzing with messages he quickly hid. I knew who was texting him. I had seen the name flash across his screen more than once. Alexandra. One evening, I told Marcus I was working late. Instead, I parked near the restaurant where he claimed he was meeting a client. He wasn't meeting a client. He was meeting her. Through the window, I watched them sit at a corner table, their heads close, their body language unmistakably intimate. At one point, he reached across the table and took her hand. At another, she laughed at something he said and touched his face. I took photographs, not because I needed legal proof, but because I wanted to remember this moment. I wanted to remember exactly who Marcus Whitmore really was. He wasn't just weak. He wasn't just a mama's boy. He was a liar and a cheat, actively maintaining 2 relationships while his family controlled everything from behind the scenes. The anger I felt burned white-hot and cleansing, but I didn't act on it yet. Instead, I went home and added the photos to my growing file. Richard and I continued meeting regularly, always in secret. He had his own evidence of the Whitmores' questionable business practices and knew people who had been hurt by them over the years. He was more than willing to help bring them down, but he asked me one thing. He said he understood his own reasons, but he wanted to know mine. Was this just revenge, or was it something deeper? I thought about that for a long time before answering. I told him it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I said the Whitmores had spent their lives using money and status to manipulate people, treating anyone they saw as beneath them as disposable. They were raising Marcus the same way, and they would keep doing this to others long after I was gone. Someone needed to show them that money couldn't protect them from consequences. Richard nodded slowly and said my grandmother would be proud. That was the moment I knew I had chosen the right path. The engagement party was scheduled for 3 weeks later. The Whitmores were hosting it at their estate and inviting everyone who mattered in the business world. Patricia treated it like a coronation, a chance to show off her flawless family. She had no idea what was coming. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. I coordinated closely with Richard, made carefully planned calls to industry contacts, and even reached out to the car manufacturer considering dropping the Whitmore dealerships. They were very interested in what I had to share. Then, the night before the party, I did one last thing. I gave Marcus one final chance to tell the truth. We were sitting in his apartment, reviewing last-minute details, when I casually asked how he felt about us and our future. He said he was excited and couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me, anything at all. He looked at me with those blue eyes I once found so charming and said there was nothing, that I was everything he had ever wanted. I asked about Alexandra. His face went pale. He recovered quickly, but I had seen the fear flash in his eyes. He said she was just an old friend, nothing more. I nodded and said I understood. And I truly did. I understood that Marcus would never be honest with me, that he would lie as long as it benefited him. He was his mother's son in every way. The next evening, I chose a dress from my Real closet, not the modest navy one I wore to that first dinner. This one was elegant, designer, and worth more than everything Patricia was wearing combined. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. It was time to show the Whitmore family exactly who they had underestimated. The Whitmore estate had been completely transformed for the party. White tents covered the manicured lawn, crystal chandeliers hung overhead, throwing prismatic light across the crowd, and a string quartet played softly near the fountain. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved through the guests with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than some people earned in an hour. Patricia had gone all out. This wasn't just a party, it was a statement. I arrived in my usual Subaru and watched the valet struggle to match my modest car with the line of Mercedes and BMWs ahead of me. One of them even asked if I was with the catering company. I smiled and handed him my keys. The walk from the parking area to the main tent felt like a runway, and with every step I peeled away the role I had been playing for the past 3 weeks. The nervous girlfriend, the grateful fiancé, the simple woman who should feel lucky to be tolerated by Patricia Whitmore. Tonight, I was Ella Graham, the real one. My dress was a deep emerald green, custom-made by a designer whose name was spoken in fashion circles with quiet reverence. My jewelry was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood quality. My grandmother's diamond pendant rested at my throat, a piece valued higher than most cars, and on my wrist was a limited edition watch owned by only 50 people in the world. For 14 months, I had hidden who I truly was. Tonight, I was done hiding. The first person to notice me was a woman I didn't recognize, someone's wife or girlfriend standing near the entrance. She looked at me, did a double take, then leaned in to whisper to her companion. They both stared as I walked past. The second person to notice was Harold Whitmore. He was greeting guests near the bar, smiling with the tired enthusiasm of a man who would rather be watching golf. When he saw me, his smile froze. His eyes moved from my face to my dress to my jewelry and back again as confusion replaced his practiced charm. I wished him a good evening and thanked him for hosting such a lovely party. He muttered something about being glad I could make it, still clearly trying to solve the puzzle I presented, and I moved on before he could ask anything else. Inside the main tent were about 100 guests, a carefully selected mix of business associates, social figures, and family friends. I recognized several faces from my research, the regional manager from the car manufacturer, a few competing dealership owners, a journalist from the local business paper, and near the champagne fountain stood Patricia Whitmore, holding court. She wore a cream-colored gown that likely cost a fortune, though it was clearly off the rack despite her efforts to suggest otherwise. Her jewelry looked impressive by normal standards but was unremarkable by the standards of real wealth. She laughed loudly at something a guest said, her head thrown back in that polished way that suggested she had learned how to fake amusement long ago. She hadn't seen me yet. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and moved through the crowd, stopping to introduce myself to several guests. Every interaction followed the same pattern: confusion at my appearance, surprise when I said I was Marcus's fiancé, then renewed confusion when my dress, jewelry, and manner didn't match whatever story they had been told about me. I could feel the shift as whispers spread, side glances followed me, and phones were subtly checked as people tried to figure out who I really was. Good. I reached Patricia's group just as she finished talking about her latest charity work. She turned with her standard frozen smile, and then her expression changed in stages: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something close to fear. She said my name as if asking a question. I greeted her warmly and thanked her for hosting such a beautiful party. Her eyes darted over me, taking in every detail: the dress that cost more than her monthly household budget, the pendant she had likely seen featured in a jewelry magazine, the watch she had probably only seen in advertisements. She asked where I had gotten these things, her voice controlled but trembling underneath. I said they were just a few pieces I'd been saving for a special occasion. Divin appeared at her side, clearly summoned by some invisible alarm. She looked at me and went through the same progression of emotions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, but she recovered more quickly. With fake sweetness, she commented that the dress was interesting and asked if it was a rental. I calmly told her the designer's name and said he was a friend who had made it especially for me. The name hit her like a slap. This was a designer who dressed celebrities, who had a waiting list years long, who didn't make custom gowns for administrative assistants struggling to pay rent. She opened her mouth to respond but no words came out. I excused myself to find Marcus, and as I walked away, I heard Patricia hiss at Vivian to find out what was going on, followed by Vivian's confused reply that none of this made sense. I smiled to myself and kept walking. The first phase of the evening was complete. The doubt had been planted, and now it was time to let it grow. Marcus found me before I found him. He stepped out from a group near the bar, his face pale and his eyes wide. He had clearly heard the whispers and seen the looks, and now he was trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the woman he thought he knew. He asked what was happening, where I had gotten the dress and jewelry, why I looked like a completely different person. I told him I looked like myself. He stared at me, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, not full understanding, just the first crack in a wall hiding an uncomfortable truth. He asked if we could talk privately. I said later, reminding him this was our engagement party and we had guests to attend to. Before he could argue, I took his arm and guided him toward a group of business associates. These were the people who actually controlled the automotive industry in our region, the ones whose opinions determined whether the Whitmore dealership survived. They had been watching me with open curiosity. I introduced myself properly this time, giving my full name, Ella Graham, and mentioned my position at my company. I watched their expressions change as recognition set in and they realized who I really was. One silver-haired man who ran a competing dealership chain said he had heard of me, mentioning that his nephew in tech had spoken about my work on innovative software solutions. I thanked him. Another guest, a woman involved in major mergers and acquisitions, asked if I was related to Margaret Graham. I told her she was my grandmother. Her eyebrows rose as she said my grandmother had been a remarkable businesswoman and that the Graham name still carried weight in certain financial circles. I felt Marcus stiffen beside me. He had no idea what any of this meant. He had never cared to ask about my family beyond surface-level questions. He had assumed poor meant insignificant and never looked deeper. That was his mistake. As the evening went on, the truth spread further with every conversation. Guests whispered, checked their phones, confirmed details. The story beneath the Whitmore's feet was shifting, and they didn't know how to stop it. About an hour into the party, Richard arrived. He found me near the rose garden while Marcus was pulled away by his father for an urgent discussion. Richard told me the manufacturer's representative was there and said the man was very interested in the documents Richard had shared earlier in the week. I asked if he was ready. Richard said he had been ready for years. We finalized the last details, then he disappeared back into the crowd, and I returned to playing the happy fiancé. Patricia approached me next. She had regained some control, though the tension around her eyes was obvious. She grabbed my arm with more force than necessary and demanded to know what I was doing. I looked at her calmly and asked what she meant. She said I knew exactly what she meant. She pointed to the dress, the jewelry, the stories I was telling about my grandmother and my job, and demanded to know what my game was. I told her there was no game, that I was simply being myself. She snapped that this was impossible, that Marcus had told her all about my situation, that I was a secretary living in a studio apartment and driving a car that belonged in a junkyard. I said Marcus had made assumptions, ones I had never confirmed. I told her I worked in tech, which was true, and that I had a support role, which was also true, since architects support development teams. I said I had never claimed to be poor, I had simply never corrected their beliefs. She asked why, and I looked her straight in the eye and said my grandmother taught me that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. I told her I wanted to know who the Whitmore family really was, and now I did. Her face drained of color. Before she could respond, the string quartet fell silent and Harold Whitmore's voice came over the speakers announcing it was time for the official toasts. Patricia looked at me with something close to fear as I smiled and walked toward the stage. Knowing the real moment had arrived. The stage at the far end of the tent was decorated with flowers and soft lights meant to feel romantic but instead felt like a spotlight waiting to expose the truth. Harold welcomed everyone and spoke about family, tradition, and strong partnerships in life and business, his eyes constantly flicking toward Patricia as she pushed through the crowd with the focus of a general heading into battle. She reached the microphone as Harold finished and took over smoothly, her composure restored, her smile flawless and cold. She talked about how proud she was of her son, how pleased she was with his engagement, and how I would be a wonderful addition to the Whitmore family. Then she shifted to business, hinting at growth, expansion, new partnerships, and an exciting future for the Whitmore dealerships. I noticed the manufacturer's representative grow visibly uncomfortable and saw Richard give him a small, knowing nod. Patricia was clearly building toward an announcement, likely about the Castellano merger meant to save their company. She called Marcus to the stage, and he joined her, nervous beneath his practiced smile, scanning the crowd until his eyes found me. Then Patricia said there was one more person who belonged on that stage, her future daughter-in-law, and she said my name. I placed my champagne down and walked forward as the tent fell silent, every step echoing as all eyes followed me. I climbed the steps and stood beside Marcus, who reached for my hand with uncertainty. Patricia handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't touch her eyes and said she was sure I wanted to say a few words. I looked at the microphone, at Marcus, at Patricia who thought she was still in control, and then at the crowd that held the Whitmore's future in its hands. I said I did want to say a few words. I thanked Patricia for her warm welcome and thanked the Whitmore family for showing me exactly who they were over the past few weeks. Patricia's smile flickered. I told the crowd that when I first came to their home, I made a decision to let them see a simple version of me, a woman without status or visible wealth, someone they would consider beneath notice. I said I wanted to see how they treated someone they thought couldn't benefit them, someone they believed was common. Patricia's face turned white. I described the dinner where I was compared to Marcus's ex, the whispered insults, being called the help, being labeled common and a gold digger by people who knew nothing about me. Marcus stared at me in horror. I said I then heard something I was never meant to hear, and I described the conversation in the study, Patricia and Vivian planning how to remove me, how I learned I was just a placeholder while Marcus's real future with Alexandra Castellano was arranged. Gasps rippled through the tent as I explained the Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble and desperate for a merger to survive, and that Marcus had been keeping his options open the entire time. I held up my phone and showed the photo of Marcus and Alexandra holding hands at a restaurant 2 weeks earlier while he claimed to be working late. Whispers exploded through the crowd as Marcus grabbed my arm and said he could explain. I told him he already had his chance and chose to lie. I turned back to the crowd and said there was more, and the silence returned, heavy and absolute. I explained that I had researched the Whitmore business and uncovered overextended credit, falling sales, and a franchise agreement on the verge of termination. Harold's face went gray. Then I said I found something even worse and looked directly at Vivian, frozen at the back of the tent. I said she had been embezzling from the company for years, starting small and growing into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her husband turned to her in shock as she shouted that it was a lie and accused me of trying to destroy their family. Richard stepped forward carrying a folder filled with proof, years of records and transactions, and handed it to the manufacturer's representative. He said the Whitmores had cheated him years ago and that when I brought him evidence of their current actions, he was glad to help. Patricia shouted that this was outrageous and threatened to sue for defamation. I calmly told her she was welcome to try, that everything I had shared was documented, verifiable, and ready for court. I looked at Marcus, standing beside me like a man watching his world collapse, and said there was one last thing. I reached up and slid the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy diamond caught the light and showed every flaw inside it. I said I would not be marrying Marcus Whitmore. I said I had never truly planned to, not after learning the truth about him and his family. I said the only reason I had accepted his proposal was to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I placed the ring back into Marcus's hand and told him to give it to Alexandra, because she was clearly the woman he actually wanted. Marcus's face collapsed. He said that wasn't true. He said he had feelings for me. He said whatever was going on with Alexandra was only business, something his mother had arranged. I told him that was exactly the problem. I said he had allowed his mother to arrange his entire life, his relationships, and his future. I said he had never once defended me when his family attacked and belittled me. I said he had lied straight to my face about Alexandra even when I gave him the chance to tell the truth. I said a man who could not be honest with the woman he claimed to love was not a man I wanted to marry. The crowd stood frozen in complete silence. I turned to face them one last time. I said my name was Ella Graham. I said I was a senior software architect who had built her career through hard work and integrity. I said I earned more in a single month than most people earned in a year. I said I lived simply because my grandmother had taught me that wealth was never the true measure of a person's worth. I said the Whitmores had shown me exactly who they were. They had revealed themselves as people who judged others by bank balances and social standing. They had treated me with open contempt because they believed I had nothing to offer them. I said that kind of character would eventually destroy them, with or without my involvement. I set the microphone down on the podium and walked off the stage. The crowd parted for me like water. No one spoke. No one tried to stop me. Behind me, chaos erupted. I didn't turn around, but I heard everything. Patricia's voice rose high and frantic as she tried to salvage what was left, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, claiming I was disturbed, insisting none of it was true. It didn't matter anymore. I heard the manufacturer's representative speaking sharply into his phone, his tone controlled and professional. I heard guests murmuring to one another, some already moving toward the exits, eager to distance themselves from the disaster unfolding. I reached the edge of the tent and paused. Vivian had trapped her husband near the bar, desperately trying to explain and justify herself. His face was hard and unreadable. He was staring at her as if the woman he had married had been replaced by a stranger wearing her face. Harold was slumped in a chair with his head buried in his hands, the powerful patriarch of the Whitmore empire reduced by the exposure of secrets he may have suspected but never wanted to face. And Marcus. Marcus stood alone on the stage, the rejected ring still clenched in his hand. He was looking at me with an expression I could no longer decipher, part anger, part grief, part regret. It no longer mattered. I stepped out of the tent and into the cool night air. The stars shone brightly overhead, completely indifferent to the human drama below. I took a deep breath and filled my lungs with air that felt cleaner, lighter. A few minutes later, Richard found me by the fountain. He said it was done. He said the manufacturer had already made the call. The Whitmore dealerships would lose their franchise agreement by the end of the month. I asked him if he felt satisfied. He said satisfaction wasn't the right word. He said it felt more like relief, like finally settling a long-standing debt. I understood exactly what he meant. He asked what I planned to do next. I said I would go home. I said I would sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. I said I would wake up the next morning and continue building the life I had created for myself, a life that had nothing to do with Marcus Whitmore or his family. Richard nodded and said my grandmother would have been proud of me tonight. The words caught me off guard, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I said I hoped so. He handed me his business card and said if I ever needed anything, I should call. He said he owed me one. I slipped the card into my purse, thanked him, and walked to the valet stand. I collected my old Subaru from a very confused attendant and drove away from the Whitmore estate for the last time. In the rearview mirror, I watched guests spill out of the tent as the party collapsed into chaos. I saw Patricia gesturing wildly, still trying to control a story that had completely slipped from her hands. I turned my eyes back to the road and didn't look again. The drive home was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove through the night, letting the miles place distance between me and everything that had happened. When I reached my modest apartment, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. I thought about Marcus, about the man I believed he was and the man he had proven himself to be. I thought about how close I had come to marrying him, to tying my life to his, to becoming part of a family that would have treated me with contempt forever. I thought about my grandmother and the lesson she had taught me about character and worth. I thought about the future, my future, the one I would build on my own terms with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I got out of the car and went inside. My apartment was small and simple, exactly how I liked it. I made myself a cup of tea, changed out of my designer dress, and sat by the window in my old, comfortable robe. The city lights shimmered below. Thousands of lives unfolding in thousands of windows. I was just one of them. Nothing special. Nothing extraordinary. And that was exactly how I wanted it. 1 week later, I sat at my kitchen table with my morning coffee when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline read, Whitmore Automotive facing closure after franchise termination. I read the article slowly, taking in every detail. The manufacturer had officially ended its partnership with the Whitmore dealerships, citing serious concerns about financial management and ethical practices. Without the franchise agreement, the dealerships could no longer sell new vehicles. Without new vehicle sales, the business could not survive. The article reported that several former business partners had come forward with complaints of their own about the Whitmore family. It mentioned an internal investigation that had uncovered financial irregularities now under review by authorities. It stated that Vivian Whitmore had been asked to step down from her position pending further inquiry. My name was not mentioned. I had asked Richard to keep me out of it, and he had respected that. The story was about the Whitmore's actions, not about the woman who exposed them. I didn't want attention or praise. I only wanted the truth to be known. And it was. I finished my coffee and looked around my small kitchen. The same kitchen where I had sat a month earlier before driving to the Whitmore estate to meet Marcus's family for the first time. The same kitchen where I had decided to test them, to see who they truly were beneath their polished surface. So much had changed since then, and yet so much had stayed exactly the same. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Marcus. He said he needed to see me. He said he could explain everything. He admitted he had made mistakes but said he still cared about me. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without replying. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay closed. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the morning sun rise over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day, a day for fresh beginnings, for moving forward, for building something better. My grandmother's pendant rested against my throat, warm against my skin. I touched it softly and thought about the woman who had taught me everything I knew about character and worth. She had lived simply, not because she had to, but because she understood that the things that truly matter can't be bought. Love. Integrity. Self-respect. The quiet knowledge that you have lived according to your principles, even when it would have been easier to compromise. The Whitmores had believed they could buy their way through life. They thought money and status made them superior, gave them the right to treat others however they pleased without consequences. They were wrong. I turned away from the window and got ready for work. My normal job at my normal company, doing work I loved with people who respected me for my skills and my character, not my bank balance. The story of the Whitmore family would keep unfolding in the weeks and months ahead. There would be investigations and legal battles. There would be consequences and fallout. The empire they had built on arrogance and deception would slowly crumble, piece by piece. But that was their story now, not mine. My story was just beginning, and it would be written on my own terms, in my own words, guided by my own values. That was the lesson my grandmother had taught me. That was the truth I had carried through every moment of the past month. A person's worth is not measured by money or social status or the opinions of people like Patricia Whitmore. It is measured by character, by the choices made when no one is watching, by how you treat people who can offer you nothing in return. The Whitmores had failed that test completely. And I had finally found the answer I had been searching for. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need Marcus's love. I didn't need anyone else's validation to know my worth. I already knew who I was, and that was enough.